Hello, I hope we're all thoroughly decompressed after Christmas and New Year. I thought I'd do another one of these. Haven't done one of these for a while. Thought maybe it was time. My first thought was to maybe do a video on the subject of Star Wars The Last Jedi. Perhaps mount some kind of defence of Star Wars The Last Jedi, because I've seen it, I like it. While it's by no means a perfect movie, I can't help but feeling that some of the sheer opprobrium that has been levelled at that movie from some of the wackier ends of the fandom spectrum is just completely off the charts. But as it happens, my favourite YouTuber, MovieBob, has done it for me. He has mounted a very fulsome defence of The Last Jedi, the which I would like to associate myself with wholeheartedly. So, yeah, rather than me spending a couple of hours mounting a defence of Last Jedi, I'm just going to tell you to go and see Bob's. He's done 4 videos on the subject of The Last Jedi so far. Did his original review, which is up on geek.com. He did a spoiler review, which I think is also on geek.com. And he's done 2 videos, one called Let's Talk About Luke Skywalker and another one called The Last Jedi is a Love Letter to Star Wars Fans. So I'll try and put links into those. They shouldn't be hard to find. But yeah, if you want to know what I think about The Last Jedi, go and see what MovieBob thinks, because that's what I think too. So I figured I'd do something else. Here's a little theory that's been bouncing around inside my head along the lines of how I would have brought Doctor Who back that I did a few months ago. This is how I would recast James Bond. Now, before we go any further, you may notice what I did not just say. I did not say, whom would I cast as James Bond? That's not the subject of this video at all, alright? I'm sure we've all got thoughts on that subject. Bond fans have always got thoughts on who should be the next James Bond. Interestingly, one of the things that brought this topic to mind is there appears to be a new press favourite in this field. The press at the moment are all very keen on the idea of a young guy called James Norton taking over after Daniel Craig leaves, which he probably will do after the next Bond movie, the which he has apparently rather grumpily agreed to do. I can see why people like the idea of James Norton, certainly from a visual point of view. He's currently playing the lead on a British crime drama called McMafia. And I can see why people are thinking about him, because if you look at him facially, he's kind of a sort of an intermediate stage between Daniel Craig's face and the more sort of traditional pretty boy good looks of your classic James Bond, isn't he? In fact, if you did one of those sort of computer morphs from Daniel Craig to Pierce Brosnan and stopped it at about 40%, you'd get James Norton. So maybe that's why people are thinking of him. But as it happens right now, there are actually a lot of good actors who'd make great next James Bonds. I mean, people are talking about Aidan Turner. Obviously, Idris keeps coming around. Somebody I think would be really good, except he probably wouldn't want it, is Dan Stevens. I know most people in this country still think of him as the nice young man from Downton Abbey. But if you ever seen a film called The Guest, you'll know why he'd actually make a really good James Bond, except he's probably having far too much fun and far too varied a career to want to do anything that would define it to the extent that playing James Bond would. Another guy who'd be pretty good is Jamie What's-His-Name from 50 Shades. There's a lot of good potential James Bonds out there. That's not what this video is about. This video is about how I would go about bringing in a new James Bond in the present continuity of the Bond movies, because that's the thing. There is actually a continuity now. There was a lot of sort of stylistic differences brought in from Casino Royale onwards in the sort of the Daniel Craig era of James Bond. But the main one, and the most notable one as far as I'm concerned, is the loss of the reset button. You see, in classic Bond movies, there was always a kind of a reset button that got hit between the films. There's no kind of ongoing continuity between them. The woman who he ends up snogging in a life raft over the end titles, you know, is going to be gone by the next movie, and there isn't going to be a word of explanation as to what happened to her. She was just this film's girl, and, you know, next film will have next film's girl. You can basically watch the old Bond movies in more or less any order you like, and they'll make about as much sense as in any other order. The only thing that would be a bit jarring would be the constant leaps backwards and forwards in technology and fashion. But there is no sort of continuity between the old Bond films. This is obviously complicated by the fact that every 10 years or so James Bond becomes somebody else. But even without that, there's no kind of through line in terms of the story. There's a couple of exceptions to this. I mean, the most obvious one is when, okay, spoiler alert, but you shouldn't be watching this movie if you're not fairly up on your old Bond movies, but spoiler alert anyway. When On Her Majesty's Secret Service ends, as the book does, with Bond falling in love, getting married, and then his wife being murdered the minute the wedding ceremony is over, you do rather expect that this will then form at least part of the spur to the plot of the next one. And Bond's going to seek out some blood-curdling vengeance trail to avenge the death of his new wife. But the trouble is, again, the casting sort of gets in the way. On Her Majesty's Secret Service, as I'm sure you know, is the only film in which Bond was played by George Lazenby. He was the first replacement Bond after Sean Connery left for the first time, after You Only Live Twice. He was a 28-year-old Australian model and had basically done no real acting at all. And while history doesn't remember him very kindly, history seems to regard him as a bit wooden, and he is a bit wooden, he actually does an incredible job in that film when you think about how little acting experience he's had to suddenly find himself dumped into the biggest movie franchise of the day. In fact, the only movie franchise of the day. In fact, the movie that basically invented the whole concept of movie franchises. Suddenly there he is fronting the whole thing at the age of about 28 when his previous biggest job was being a hunky guy in a chocolate commercial. My biggest job on TV was being a snotty dad in a Kleenex commercial. I've now got more acting experience than George Lazenby had when they made him James Bond. It's ridiculous. And famously, he was only around for the one movie. He apparently, it was his choice to only do one movie. He basically didn't really get on with the whole sort of Bond establishment. I don't think they made him feel particularly welcome. And also, it was 1969, and like most guys his age at the time, he was a bit of a hippie. He famously annoyed the hell out of the producers by turning up to the premiere with kind of George Harrison long hair and beard. And so he wasn't really into the whole James Bond thing, so he packed it after one. Whereupon, they get Sean Connery back for the next one, Diamonds Are Forever. Sean Connery is sort of cajoled with very amounts of money given to various, I think, Scottish educational charities, and very reluctantly agrees to do one more Bond movie. You can tell his heart's not in it for the entire film. But what this also means is that rather than Bond setting out to avenge his dead wife becoming the crux of the next movie, the whole thing is dealt with in rather perfunctory fashion before the opening credits. And it's rather hard not to escape the conclusion that Sean Connery didn't really give a shit about what happened to George Lazenby's wife. So, like I say, there's not much in the way of ongoing continuity between the movies. The fact that Bond has a dead wife is called back to, I think, precisely twice in the whole of the rest of the series. Once in the pre-credits of For Your Eyes Only, and then there's one line of dialogue in License to Kill. And it's basically from License to Kill onwards that the internal chronology of the Bond movies just stops even trying to work, because you could almost pretend that it's all one story up to the end of the Timothy Dalton era. And obviously, Timothy Dalton is a lot younger than Sean and Roger, but he is actually weirdly about the same age as George. So you could almost pretend that from Dr. No to License to Kill, which is 27 years, that's all one story. But then when Pierce Brosnan takes over in 1995, that suddenly makes no sense whatsoever, because now you have a Bond who either was about 11 years old when he defeated Goldfinger, or is the best-looking 70-year-old on the planet. From Pierce Brosnan onwards, there's no point in even trying to pretend that these movies have any kind of consistent continuity. And then, of course, when Daniel Craig comes in, they deliberately ditch the existing continuity and actually start off with a reboot/origin story, which is only muddied slightly by the fact that they kept Judi Dench on as M, but why wouldn't you? It was Judi Dench. But here's the thing. There's a difference once Daniel Craig takes over, which is that suddenly the movies become actual sequels. The four Daniel Craig movies we've had so far do actually follow one from the other. Quantum of Solace is a direct sequel to Casino Royale. It begins literally 5 minutes after Casino Royale ends. Then Skyfall takes a bit of a sideways step, but still ties up some of the loose ends. And then again Inspector, which was a mess, quite frankly. But again, you have callbacks to Quantum and Casino Royale. You have the Mr. White characters reintroduced. You have references back to the Rene Mathis character. So the four Daniel Craig movies you have so far are following a straight continuity. They are following on one from the other. Although the end of Spectre makes no sense whatsoever, so how the next one will start, who the hell knows. But what this means, as far as I'm concerned, having now done that, I'm not sure when Daniel Craig leaves, whether it's after the next one or the one after, whether they can just do what they always used to do when you get a new James Bond, which is just recast him and carry on regardless. Just kind of pretend it hasn't happened. I'm not sure that they can really get away with that in the framework of this new Bond universe. I mean, when Judi Dench left as M, they wrote her out. They didn't just write her out, they actually killed her off. and introduced her replacement within the narrative, and actually managed to keep it quite successfully quiet that the character played by Ralph Fiennes, introduced at the beginning of Skyfall, is basically there to become the new M. And while I think Skyfall is actually fairly overrated, I do like that end scene and the notion that all three movies up to that point have actually been prequels, that were finally back in M's wood-panelled office with the big leather door, and Moneypenny is in the office outside. The idea that all three movies have been basically actually trying to get us back to the, the traditional Bond status quo, as it were. Bond status quo. There's a theme song that never happened. So, like I say, I'm not sure it would be appropriate. I mean, they may well do, but I kind of think that they shouldn't just recast James Bond and carry on regardless like they always used to. I think you need to write Daniel Craig out and write the new guy in. I think there has to be some way of doing that. So how would you do it? All right, here's how I would have done it. Now, apologies if you've seen this theory of mine before. I have posted it on Twitter a couple of times. But this is how I think you bring in a new James Bond in this new Bond universe, right? Stage one, you cast your new James Bond. As per usual, you cast him, whether it's Aidan Turner, James Norton, Dan Stevens, Idris, Tom Hardy. Could be Tom Hardy. My only problem with Tom Hardy is he's a bit little. Yeah, he could absolutely do it, but he's only about 5'7", I seem to recall. But, we live in a world where Tom Cruise is Jack Reacher, so... Anyway, so you cast your new James Bond, you have your press release and your photo call as ever. Daniel Craig releases a one-line statement wishing him all the best, and congratulations, we have a new James Bond, and then you actually start to make the film. Now, here's what you do in the film. You start the movie, new guy's there. He's right there. You maybe have some nice reveal shot like the one at the top of the cliff they did for Timothy Dalton, or the one hanging upside down in the toilet they did for Pierce Brosnan. You reveal the new Bond in your pre-credits action sequence, and he's there. He's there. He's James Bond already. He's doing James Bond stuff in your usual insane action sequence before the credits. Roll the credits. You have, new guy as Ian Fleming's James Bond in whatever the movie's called. You just start, as per, with your new James Bond, just like they always used to in the good old days. The first hint that maybe not all is as was, is that when we get back to MI6 headquarters, all the old gang are there, still played by the actors, assuming that it's still Ralph Fiennes as M, and Rory Kinnear as Bill, and Naomi Harris as Miss Moneypenny, and Ben Whishaw as Q, assuming that none of those guys have left. They're all still there. And they're all interacting with the new guy. Eagle-eyed viewers will notice that nobody calls him James or Mr. Bond. Everybody just calls him 007, right? And then we go back out to the field and we carry on with the story. He's out there. He's calling himself Bond James Bond and doing Bond James Bond stuff. At some point, he should maybe run into somebody who knows James Bond. Maybe it's Felix, still played by Jeffrey Wright. And Felix mutters something about, I don't know who this character is, but this is not James Bond. And then at some point you have the reveal of what is going on, which is this. James Bond, as in Daniel Craig, is dead. Finally got himself killed. Finally got himself killed, on the other hand, in the middle of some very important job, the which cannot be abandoned just because James finally got himself whacked. So, new 00 agent is promoted to the 00 section, given Bond's vacant 007 number, and sent out to tie up the loose ends of the job that James was on, and told to refer to himself as James Bond until we can complete this mission, because that's who everybody else involved in this mission thought they were dealing with. So he isn't really James Bond, but he's got to call himself James Bond in order to get this job done. And he is 007 because that's his number. That, if you like, is the reveal as to what's going on. Now, if you wanted to really over-egg it, optional final twist. At some point towards the end of the movie, he can either get himself into some terrible fix and be rescued by, or just run into, a bearded Daniel Craig, who, once the dust has settled, has some lines along the lines of, apparently you're the new 007, and the new James Bond, apparently, to which our boy can mutter some kind of mumbled apology along the lines of, well, you weren't using it, whereupon old James Bond can say, well, you can keep it, it's a boring name anyway, I never liked it. And then just as bearded old James Bond disappears, he can turn to new James Bond and say, thanks. And new James Bond can say, what for? And old James Bond can say, for letting me stay dead this time. Whereupon he disappears into the night, never to be seen again. That's how I do it, okay? Actually have a new James Bond, who by the end of the movie is James Bond 007, to exactly the same extent that anybody else ever was. But you now know why we've got a new guy. And that, to my mind, will also give you some fun character stuff to play with. Because the other difference between the Craig movies and the previous Bond movies is James Bond actually gets character stuff to do. The new Bond movies are actually about James Bond in a way that old Bond movies kind of weren't. They weren't really about him at all. He was just almost like a cipher. He was just this ridiculously cool guy in a ridiculously sharp suit who would turn up, kick the bad guy's ass, crack a few shit jokes, and then get off with some good-looking woman and go home. Nothing really happened to him. He wasn't really in the story, as it were, whereas to a far greater extent, the Daniel Craig movies are about him, possibly too much in the case of Spectre, which I think goes rather too far with the whole angst-ridden backstory bit for James Bond. I thought Skyfall gave you more than enough of that to work with. But you could have a lot of interesting new character stuff, both in this movie and indeed in the new movies going forward, that you have essentially this new novice James Bond who's still trying to live up to the reputation earned for him by somebody else. So that's how I would do it. Anyway, very keen to hear your thoughts on this. Feel free to drop us an email at either mitchbenn@hotmail.com or mitchbennpatreon@gmail.com. If you are not yet signed up to the YouTube channel, please do so. The more subscribers I get, the more attention these videos get. If you are not yet signed up to the Patreon, I would very much ask you to consider doing so. It's a worthwhile thing. They're not going to do that change to the payment structure they said they were going to do that was going to make things a bit awkward for everybody. So please, if you think you want to in any way help me do the things I do, most of which are a lot more fun than this, please consider joining the Patreon. Right, well that's it. Happy 2018, everybody. I shall be putting a podcast together in some point in the next couple of weeks. So if you know any comic songwriters out there, give them a poke in the ribs. Tell them to send the songs in. We'll include them in that. And in the meantime, yeah, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.